Let's bring into the conversation Dr. Sal Mercogliano, an associate professor of history at Campbell University. He joins me now. Doctor, thanks so much for being with us. I know you have covered this story so extensively, and I wanted to first up ask you, right now we are about a day and a half when that oxygen there in the submersible, we're told, will run dry, will deplete itself. What does your gut tell you right now about the likelihood of finding them alive or finding the vessel itself at all?
Well, obviously, the further we go into this, the less that happens. And unfortunately, operating at these depths, there's a very thin margin of chance when something goes wrong to be saved. You've got a couple of issues. If this submersible has gone to the bottom, you just don't have an oxygen issue. You have a heat issue because of the temperature below the surface, 13,000 feet down. It's almost freezing down there. You would have an issue where the crew may not last long enough because of the lack of heat, let alone water and food. If they're bobbing at the surface, they have to be rescued because of the nature of this submersible. The crew can't just pop the hatch open if should they be on the surface. So as time goes by, their chances do diminish.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about the vessel itself. It's called Titan. It's operated by OceanGate. There's been reporting out there to suggest possibly that the creation and marketing of this vessel as it was created may not have been above board. Are you seeing some of those concerns, some of that reporting there? What do we know about this specific vessel?
So, typically when you operate ships, they're flagged in a country. They have to conform to international standards. And pulling in and out of ports, you're met by agents from those countries who will do inspection. And then there are third-party classification societies. This vessel doesn't seem to fall under any of those parameters. This is not a flagged vessel. It doesn't belong to a country, even though it was launched off a Canadian vessel. It's not a Canadian registered vessel. There was no third-party classification agency, such as the American Bureau of Shipping or Lloyd's of London, who did any sort of inspections to ensure that the vessel met all those criteria. And basically what it was is this operating company had this submersible built, and they're basically saying, okay, we think that this is safe to operate. And there was no redundancy and no checks on it, which is going to cause a lot of problem because, believe it or not, within the submersible industry, and there are other submersibles out there that are used commercially and for recreational diving, many of them undergo some very rigorous inspections and testing.
Yeah, from what we have read and from what some of the reports suggest, design safety regulations are there. You said that, and they are quite cumbersome. You said that as well. But from what we know about this one, OceanGate, contracted it, possibly created it themselves in a private way. And so we don't even know if it's allowed or permissible to go that deep, are we? There was a report in the New Republic today saying that a former employee of Watergate who was fired over raising some of these alarms and some of these questions said this particular submersible could only go about 2,000 feet down.
Right. And the problem you have is where they're diving is international waters. It's the lawless Wild West out there in some cases. And so there's not really a regulation. Once you disembark this vessel off the Canadian vessel, it can basically operate into this deep water. And without that regulation, without that checking, it's very difficult for any kind of security or any sort of third party to come in and check that. And what we do know is that there were no entities that did those checks.
Yeah, and I want to talk about going down that deep, 13,000 feet deep, to get to the wreck site of the Titanic itself. We're told this was only supposed to be about a 2-hour trip down there, and they lost communication about an hour and 45 minutes in. But right now, can you kind of explain, and we were talking about this in the newsroom, they go down straight from the ship from which it was launched. So presumably it's sitting right below that anchor ship above water. Do I have this right?
Actually, they would be a little bit up current because of the design of this submersible. They can't maneuver a great distance. And so when they basically detach from the platform that they're launched on, this submersible just drops. It doesn't have buoyancy tanks like a modern submarine that you can go up and down. It will either go down or back up. And when they drop it, they actually have to drop it kind of ahead of the current because of the Gulf Stream out there. It's going to move. And so they have to basically get themselves in a position, plan on 2-hour drop down to the bottom, and then come within close position proximity to the Titanic. But because of the limited resources in this submersible, they actually have to be directed there by the kind of the mothership. And that's why communication is so important.
Yeah, we're learning that this was OceanGate's third annual voyage to the Titanic wreck site to kind of see the deterioration. It's been more than 110 years since the Titanic went down there in the waters of the North Atlantic on a very cold April night. The sunken ship is about 2.4 miles below the surface, and these 5 individuals on board. This is a very, very niche trip. You have billionaires, the uber wealthy, who want to see this up close. They would describe themselves, I'm assuming, as, explorers, adventurers, what have you. But there's a lot of functional, practical purposes for submersibles, not just to go up close, pay $200,000 to catch a glimpse of the Titanic, right?
Right. And when you look at Titan was really built for this one mission. It was really designed to dive down that. If you look at its maximum depth, it's the maximum depth basically of Titanic. But in the commercial world, we see submersibles being used in laying of cables, in the offshore drilling industry, but also a lot of that is closer into shore. So there are oversight, there's government oversight. You're operating within either territorial waters or the economic zone of countries. So you will have regulations in place. Where Titanic is, it's international waters. It's beyond the 12-mile and even the 200-mile economic limit for nations. And that's really where we're seeing this gray area in the operation of Titan.
So also I wanted to ask you, too, what do you think the communications are like? Because I think a lot of people are wondering, why can't they get in touch with the submersible via whatever communications program they have in the ship above? That's a question so many of us have, unless it's completely gone and the power's gone.
Right. And as far as we know, the typical communication they had was actually via text. They didn't have voice communication because of the depths involved here. Very hard to get voice communication. So they were able to use basically text messages to give them directions. The loss of communications is key because, again, this submersible cannot really find Titanic. It has to be directed toward it.
And you mentioned kind of offline that without communications, this is like you're trying to find a floating minivan in the North Atlantic. And so we know the search radius is about 10,000 square miles. We're hearing it kind of being described as the size of the state of Connecticut. I want to put up this tweet because we're also getting some ideas, some suggestions from members of Congress. Dan Crenshaw, the Republican from Texas. I want to see if you kind of agree with one of his assertions, one of his suggestions here about what to use during the search itself. He says the U.S. Coast Guard has access to a highly capable rescue submersible called the Magellan, which is ready to deploy to rescue this lost submarine near the Titanic. But I'm hearing disturbing reports that U.S. Coast Guard officials are blocking or delaying the Magellan from being deployed. We're also hearing from some other members of Congress, they want nuclear submarines to be involved, deployed in this search. Is that the right time to do this? Does that require these very, very high-level vessels for a search like this? And what does that take?
Well, the problem you have here is the depth that potentially we're seeing this submersible at. 13,000 feet below the ocean. Most Navy submarines operate a max depth of about 1,000 feet. And this is the problem that's really hindering this search. The sonar buoys, the echolocating is designed to find submarines in a very narrow parameter close to the surface of the ocean. When you get down 13,000 feet, even the top Navy subs cannot operate in that depth.
Okay, yeah, and I was referring here to this conversation that Representative Brandon Williams, Republican from New York, had on Neil Cavuto's program today, and he offered that idea, saying the sonar capabilities of a nuclear sub is far and away the best in the world at locating things underwater. But you just kind of described some of the limitations and liabilities of trying to get that on the ground, right?
Right. I mean, if you're trying to locate a submarine, for example, so if you're the U.S. Navy trying to locate a Russian Chinese submarine, that is a much larger object. It has running propulsion in it. So, and it's a big metal sphere. So you can use passive sonar to listen for it, active sonar, that ping sound, which will reflect off. This object, this submersible, is the size of a minivan. So it's really hard to find. It's very quiet because there's really no machinery running in it, and it's not steel. It's this carbon fiber alloy. And so even traditional military equipment is going to have a hard time locating this vessel.
You know, and Sal, just lastly, if the worst comes to pass in this story and we kind of go into late Thursday and there has been no good signs of finding this vessel, the Titan, this submersible, will this industry have to take a very deep and close look at doing something like this again?
I think number one, you go with this as a rescue until the time parameter is out. Been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. You keep going as with the mantra that this is a rescue until you run out. But I do think the industry will have to take a look. I mean, there's a lot of questions that are going to be raised. How is it that the Canadian Coast Guard and the Canadian Registry allowed this vessel to operate on board a Canadian vessel out of a Canadian port? This is also a U.S. company. And so there's going to be some finger pointing, unfortunately, when this is all said and done.
Yeah, and of course, we now know all 5 of the individuals on board. We're learning about them as this story continues to break here. Sal Mercogliano, we always appreciate your insight. This was very, very helpful to make sense of this story, and we'll talk again. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, hope you found that informative. Obviously, this is a story we will stay with throughout the course of this week. I want to put up this tweet here. We're just getting this in. This is a statement in from Action Aviation. It says, Captain Hamish Harding, family and Action Aviation released a statement saying Harding is currently on board the Ocean Gate Titan submarine, and they look forward to welcoming him home, adding they put great faith and trust in the expertise of search and rescue teams with the statement here. And I know it's difficult to read here, but you can see there they are saying the Harding family and Action Aviation politely request privacy at this time.